Winter, a time of serene beauty, where snow blankets the earth in a peaceful hush. But beneath this tranquil facade, chilling tales of terror await. Tonight, we delve into 3 disturbing true stories that unfolded amidst the cold embrace of winter. In the winter of 2010, Sarah, an avid writer, retreated to a secluded cabin in northern Ontario to work on her novel. She had always found solace in the quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin, nestled deep within a dense forest, offered the perfect sanctuary for her creative process. The snow-covered landscape, with its serene beauty, was both inspiring and isolating, providing the ideal backdrop for her writing retreat. The nearest town was miles away, and she relished the isolation. The journey to the cabin had been arduous, with the snow-covered roads making travel difficult. But Sarah was determined, driven by the need to escape the distractions of everyday life. The isolation was not just a physical distance from others, but a mental space where she could immerse herself fully in her work. She had stocked up on supplies, ensuring she had everything she needed for her stay. One night, as a blizzard raged, she heard a faint knock on the door. The wind howled outside and the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the world in white. The sound was so unexpected that she almost dismissed it as a figment of her imagination. But there it was again, a soft, persistent knock that sent a shiver down her spine. Puzzled, she peered through the window but saw nothing. The night was dark and the snowstorm obscured her view. The frosted glass made it difficult to see clearly, and the swirling snow outside created an eerie, almost otherworldly atmosphere. She strained her eyes, trying to make out any shapes or figures, but the landscape remained empty and silent. Assuming it was the wind, she returned to her work. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow around the room. Sarah tried to focus on her writing, but the strange knock had unsettled her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The words on the page seemed to blur, and her thoughts wandered back to the mysterious sound. The knocking persisted, louder this time. It was insistent, almost demanding her attention. The door rattled slightly with each knock, and the sound echoed through the cabin. Sarah's heart raced as she stood up, her curiosity and apprehension growing with each step she took towards the door. Curiosity piqued. Sarah opened the door to find a young boy, no older than 10, shivering on her doorstep. His small frame was barely visible against the backdrop of the snowstorm. He looked fragile and vulnerable, his thin clothes offering little protection against the biting cold. Sarah's heart went out to him, and she quickly ushered him inside. His clothes were outdated, and his eyes held a vacant stare. It was as if he had stepped out of another time, his attire reminiscent of a bygone era. The boy's eyes, though vacant, seemed to hold a depth of sorrow and loss that belied his young age. Sarah couldn't help but wonder where he had come from and how he had ended up at her cabin in the middle of a blizzard. He spoke little, only mentioning that he was lost. His voice was soft and barely audible, carrying a weight of sadness that tugged at Sarah's heart. She tried to ask him more questions, but he remained silent, his eyes downcast. It was clear that he had been through something traumatic, and Sarah felt a deep sense of responsibility to help him. Concerned, Sarah tried contacting the authorities, but the phone lines were down due to the storm. She felt a pang of frustration and helplessness. The storm had cut off all communication with the outside world, leaving her alone to deal with the situation. She knew she had to keep the boy safe until the storm passed and help could arrive. As the night deepened, Sarah noticed the boy hadn't touched his drink and remained eerily silent. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames with a distant look in his eyes. The warmth of the cabin did little to thaw the chill that seemed to emanate from him. Sarah watched him closely, her concern growing with each passing minute. When she turned away for a moment, she heard a whisper, "He's coming!" The voice was faint, almost like a breath carried on the wind. It sent a shiver down her spine, and she spun around, her eyes scanning the room for the source of the sound. But there was no one there, only the boy still sitting silently by the fire. Startled, she looked back, but the boy had vanished, leaving the blanket untouched. It was as if he had never been there at all. The room felt colder, and the silence was deafening. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She called out for the boy, but there was no response, only the howling wind outside. The next morning, footprints led from her door into the forest, but never returned. The fresh snow had preserved the tracks perfectly, a silent testimony to the boy's presence. Sarah followed the footprints with her eyes, but they disappeared into the dense forest, leaving her with more questions than answers. The mystery of the boy's appearance and sudden disappearance weighed heavily on her mind. Locals later told her of a boy who had disappeared in that area decades ago, his body never found. The story sent chills down Sarah's spine. The boy she had seen matched the description perfectly, right down to the outdated clothes. It was as if he had stepped out of the past, a ghostly visitor seeking solace in the warmth of her cabin. The experience left Sarah with a profound sense of unease, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. Mark was an experienced ice fisherman, a man who had spent countless winters braving the harsh elements of the frozen lakes. His knowledge of the ice was unparalleled, and he prided himself on knowing the safest spots to set up his gear. He had a routine, a set of rituals that he followed meticulously. Each year, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Mark would prepare his equipment, ensuring everything was in perfect working order. He would check the weather forecast, study the ice conditions, and plan his trips with precision. In January 2015, he ventured onto Lake Superior, setting up his gear as he'd done countless times before. The lake was a vast expanse of white, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The air was crisp and the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. It was the perfect day for ice fishing. As dusk approached, the temperature began to drop and the sky took on a deep purplish hue. It was then that Mark noticed an old man fishing nearby, someone he hadn't seen before. The man seemed out of place, his presence unsettling in the otherwise serene landscape. The old man wore tattered clothes, his face weathered and lined with age. He stared intently at the water as if searching for something just beneath the surface. There was a haunting quality to his gaze, a sense of sorrow and longing that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. Feeling uneasy, Mark decided to pack up his gear. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ice, and he didn't want to be caught out in the dark. He gathered his equipment, his movements hurried and tense. As he turned to leave, the old man finally spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying a note of warning. "The ice is thin tonight," he said, his words hanging in the air like a ghostly echo. Mark paused, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced back at the old man, but the figure remained still, his eyes fixed on the water. Dismissing it as a trick of the light or perhaps a figment of his imagination, Mark began walking back towards the shore. The ice beneath his feet felt solid, and he reassured himself that he knew this lake better than anyone. He had fished here for years without incident. Suddenly, without warning, the ice beneath him cracked with a deafening sound. In an instant, Mark was plunged into the freezing water, the cold searing through his body like 1,000 needles. He gasped for breath, his limbs flailing as he struggled to stay afloat. As he fought to keep his head above water, he saw the old man standing over the hole, watching him with an expression of calm detachment. There was no hint of malice in his eyes, only a deep, abiding sadness. Mark's strength was fading, and he knew he had only moments left. With a final desperate effort, Mark managed to pull himself out of the icy water. He collapsed onto the ice, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. The cold was unbearable, but he was alive. He lay there for a moment, trying to gather his strength. When he finally looked around, the old man had vanished. There was no trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. The lake was silent and still, the only sound the distant howl of the wind. Mark's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Later, after he had made it back to safety, Mark learned of a fisherman who had drowned in that exact spot years prior. The man's body had never been recovered, and his spirit was said to haunt the lake, warning others of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had encountered something otherworldly that day, a ghostly presence that had saved his life. The Thompson family had just moved into their dream home in December 2020. They had been searching for the perfect house for months, and when they found this charming suburban home, they knew it was the one. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, the house was everything they had ever wanted. It had a spacious yard for the kids to play in, a cozy fireplace for those cold winter nights, and enough rooms to accommodate their growing family. The Thompsons were excited to start this new chapter of their lives, especially with the holiday season just around the corner. It was a picturesque house, perfect for raising their two young children. The snow-covered landscape added a magical touch to their new home, making it look like something out of a storybook. The children, Emily and Jack, were thrilled with the move. They spent their days building snowmen and having snowball fights in the front yard, their laughter echoing through the crisp winter air. The Thompsons felt like they were living in a winter wonderland, and they couldn't have been happier. One evening, as snow piled high outside, their daughter Emily spoke of a woman she saw in her room. She had been playing with her toys when she noticed a figure standing by the window. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the figure didn't disappear. Emily described the woman to her parents, saying she looked sad and lonely. Her parents listened patiently, thinking it was just a child's vivid imagination at work. They assured her that there was no one else in the house and that she had nothing to worry about. She described her as pale, with long black hair and a white dress. Emily's description was so detailed that it sent a chill down her parents' spines. They couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy, but they didn't want to scare their daughter. They told her that it was probably just a dream and that she should try to get some sleep. Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was real. The parents dismiss it as an imaginary friend. They'd heard of children creating imaginary friends before, and they thought this was no different. They didn't want to make a big deal out of it, hoping that Emily would eventually forget about the woman. However, the thought lingered in the back of their minds, and they couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Over the next few nights, strange occurrences plagued the household. It started with small things like doors creaking open on their own and lights flickering. The family tried to brush it off as the house settling or electrical issues, but the incidents became more frequent and harder to ignore. The once cozy and inviting home began to feel cold and unwelcoming. Footsteps echoed in the halls, whispers filled the rooms, and objects moved on their own. The children were the first to notice the strange happenings. Emily would wake up in the middle of the night hearing soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Jack's toys would be moved from one room to another even though no one had touched them. The parents started to experience the phenomena as well. They would hear footsteps in the hallway when everyone was supposed to be asleep, and they would find objects in different places from where they had left them. In one photograph, a woman matching Emily's description stood in front of the house. The discovery of the photograph was unsettling. It was an old, faded picture that they found in the attic while searching for holiday decorations. The woman in the photograph had the same pale complexion, long black hair, and white dress that Emily had described. The family couldn't believe their eyes. It was as if the woman from Emily's vision had come to life. Research revealed she was the previous owner who had perished in a snowstorm, her body found frozen just outside. The more they dug into the history of the house, the more they uncovered about the tragic past of the previous owner. She had lived alone and had been caught in a severe snowstorm one fateful night. Unable to find her way back inside, she had succumbed to the freezing temperatures. Her body was discovered the next morning, just a few feet from the front door. The Thompsons were horrified by the revelation and began to understand the source of the haunting. During the session, a chilling voice whispered, "This is my home." Desperate for answers, the Thompsons decided to hold a séance to communicate with the spirit. They gathered in the living room, the atmosphere tense and filled with anticipation. As they held hands and called out to the spirit, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, and a faint, chilling voice echoed, "This is my home." The family was terrified. They had hoped to find peace, but instead, they had confirmed their worst fears. Terrified, the Thompsons vacated the house, never to return. The haunting had become too much for them to bear. They packed their belongings and left the house, seeking refuge with relatives until they could find a new place to live. The once dream home now stood abandoned, a silent witness to the tragic events that had unfolded within its walls. The Thompsons never spoke of the haunting again, but the memory of the pale woman in the white dress would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Winter's beauty often masks its dangers. As these stories remind us, the cold can conceal more than just ice and snow. It can hide secrets, spirits, and shadows that linger long after the thaw.